providing you with in-kind support and maintenance, free room and board, that your SSI check would be reduced typically by about a third. That's why it's good for there to be a rental agreement for the room and board with the parents, where the SSI recipient is turning over a certain amount of money to them for the fair value of the rental and the room and board, and then the full SSI check comes to the recipient, and that SSI check can be used obviously for the room and board. The next slide, we talk about establishing relationships with the local mental health and intellectual disability agency. They provide typically an array of services, casework, crisis management, which is really important. In the estate planning we do, especially with older families, we frequently see where they do not have a crisis intervention plan in place, so that if mom and dad were ever, God forbid, in a car accident or a plane accident, and both of them were either became disabled themselves or deceased, what will happen to their child with disabilities? So really, the earlier you can make that contact and get a caseworker with your local mental health, intellectual disability agency, the better. And there are, depending on your state, a wide variety of programs available, and especially there are growing numbers of Medicaid waiver programs, either to provide funding to maintain someone in the community, or to provide a group home program, or to provide all kinds of community-based services. And so getting that eligibility for Medicaid is very important, because so many of the programs nowadays that are provided by states are funded through the Medicaid agency. Also, you want to connect with, as we've already discussed, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, or whatever it's called in your state. That they can do evaluations, diagnostics, counseling, training. There are programs that even are in formal schools that can include room and board, and many of these vocational schools that are residential are absolutely fantastic. And by the way, there have been recent studies that show that individuals with an HVAC certificate make more in their lifetime than people with liberal arts degrees. So, you know, no one should ever poo-poo the importance of solid vocational training, and many of the individuals who pass through those programs live very meaningful, productive, and financially stable lives. And, you know, in addition to those sorts of programs, they can help with home modifications, obtaining tools and licenses for occupations, and providing job site modifications. The next slide involves, and I'll go through this fairly quickly, mental health services in approximate order of level of restrictiveness. And we provide this because the Americans with Disabilities Act requires that individuals who are provided mental health services by their state provide them in the most integrated setting. And so simply placing people into intensive segregated programs is hardly the treatment of choice that should be utilized consistent with the ADA. So, again, each state may have somewhat different terminology, but basically the least restrictive is outpatient therapy. And then if this young person is still in school, it would be a school-based mental health service. Many public high schools and charter schools nowadays have mental health services integrated into their schools. And in many cases, they can charge Medicaid or medical assistance for providing those services, which is a tremendous economic boost to school systems. Most colleges now have significant therapeutic intervention programs available on campus. They can be inconsistent. It certainly varies from school to school, but those kinds of school-based mental health services are now very available in most colleges. Next, we have behavioral health rehabilitation services, and that may be where a behavior shaper comes into the home, comes into the school, where an aide here in Pennsylvania, we call them therapeutic support staff, may accompany or work with the adolescent anywhere from 5 to 30 hours a week to help manage behavior consistent with a positive behavior shaping plan. We now know through research that we can modify and manage and shape behavior through the use of positive interventions. The school system should, for children that have behavior that interfere with their learning or the learning of others, undertake a functional assessment of behavior. And you can look on the internet to see the scope and the process that's used in obtaining a proper functional assessment of behavior, where you're looking to identify the triggers for behavior and how you can intervene to address those triggers in a positive way, oftentimes catching the kid being good, to reward positive behaviors and to try to maintain adversives in response to negative behaviors to a minimum. Partial hospitalization services, where a young person may go to a hospital or a clinic setting for several hours a day in lieu of school, or perhaps after school. Then the next slide, family-based mental health services, where the entire family is brought in for family counseling. And by the way, one of the another forgotten area of IEPs are family therapy and family training. That is a related service that, if necessary for the child to make meaningful educational progress, should be provided, where the family is actually provided training services to manage behavior, to manage executive functioning issues, to help identify means of addressing both emotional needs and areas such as homework completion, community-based skills. So family training is something that is easily forgotten and often ignored in the IEP process, and where it is properly used, it can be a very robust and helpful service. Next is community residential rehabilitation services, where basically you have a young person or a young adult in a facility that is residential, where the therapies are oftentimes brought into the home, or at least there is a therapeutic milieu in the home, followed by therapy outside of the home. Next is a more intensive residential program, an RTF, a residential treatment facility. And in those cases, it is usually because the child has significant behaviors that require intensive staffing to attempt to manage. And finally, of course, the most significant and most restrictive is inpatient psychiatric hospitalization. Finally, let's talk for just a few moments about the use of powers of attorney for young adults. This is something that is often overlooked but can be very valuable to families, especially for an adolescent that is struggling. A power of attorney is a document where the maker of the power appoints another individual as the agent or attorney in fact. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, the attorney in fact doesn't have to be an attorney, but can be any adult competent individual. Although most states don't have a lot of guidance as to the level of competency that has to be possessed to enter into a power of attorney, most of us view that a power of attorney can be provided by an individual with a disability, so long as that individual possesses a sufficient understanding of the authority being granted, that they basically know what authority they're giving to someone else so that they can make a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary decision. This is a power of attorney is far less intrusive than guardianship. Guardianship is where the person is declared to be incapacitated and unable to make and communicate responsible decisions on their own behalf. So the power of attorney, since the person has to have capacity to enter into it, and it can be revoked at any time, is considered a much less intrusive alternative. from the standpoint of obtaining legal services to provide a guardianship versus a power of attorney, it's much, much less expensive because it's usually a simple and straightforward meeting, a document that, while it's longer than when I started practicing law because of changes in the statute, nonetheless, it is relatively straightforward. While a guardianship involves filing a court petition, serving the individual, filing notice of service, giving notice to all the next of kin, having a formal hearing, getting a physician to either testify or provide a written deposition, much, much bigger deal. So wherever we can use the power of attorney, we certainly want to do that. And when an attorney is dealing with an individual with disabilities, we conduct essentially a mini mental status examination. We want to make sure that the person understands the nature and quality of what he or she is doing, that they're oriented to time, place, person, purpose, and recognizes the consequences of entering into the power of attorney. And the final slide is that which we have mentioned previously, colleges for special needs students. There's a number of excellent websites that address finding colleges or simply post-secondary training. We say they're colleges, but just by way of example, there are colleges such as East Stroudsburg here in Pennsylvania and Cape Cod Community College in Massachusetts that have programs for individuals who are not actually taking traditional college courses but are living on the college campus and are developing their adult skills, they're developing social skills, they're developing vocational skills while being in that college atmosphere. And typically living in a dorm where they have adequate supervision. So Nancy, have I covered everything?
I believe so. I think we knocked it out of the park.
That's great. And I want to thank all of you who participated. We had a